Hello everyone, and welcome back to the History of Africa podcast. I'm your host, Andy. Last episode, we followed the Roman invasion of the Garamantes, as the Roman governor of the province of Africa, consisting of modern Tunisia and coastal Libya, invaded the Garamantian kingdom in order to punish Garamantian raids and loosen the tight control that Garamantian merchants held over burgeoning trade routes across the Sahara. However, while this invasion temporarily weakened the Garamantian state, the height of the Garamantes had not yet been reached. As the Garamantes reach their civilizational heights, though, perhaps we'll also see some early signs of some of the bubbling problems that will eventually lead to their demise. Season 5, Episode 5, Life During the Classical Garamantes Age. When Balbus and his Roman army left Fezzan following their invasion of the Garamantian kingdom, they left it up to our imagination the state that the country was in. Whether the country was left in complete ruin through a devastating Roman campaign, or whether the war caused only minor damage to the kingdom's cities and infrastructure remains, to this day, a mystery. The archaeological evidence at Garama tells us that, at least in the capital city, the damage from the invasion was noticeable but not apocalyptic. There is no major layer of ash or soot, but there was a notable spurt in the construction of new buildings, which is likely a sign of rebuilding after the destruction of what had been there before. If Balbus's expedition did cause damage to the Garamantian kingdom, however, it appears that this damage was quite short-lived. And in an odd twist, the era following this invasion would not be one of slow recovery, but an explosion of culture, prosperity, bold new architecture, and the beginning of the Garamantian Golden Age. So what exactly led to this seismic shift in the history of the Garamantes? Well, one major contributing factor was the introduction of a new species of domesticated animal, an animal that would change the history of life in the Sahara forever. When the Romans invaded Garama, they brought with them the camel. Yeah, I told you all last episode that camels would be very important soon, and, well, this is why. While camels had been used to cross the desert in Egypt for quite some time before the 1st century AD, their use as pack animals had been limited to routes east into the Sinai and Arabia, and a little bit in the southern caravan routes with Nubia when the Nile reached its first impassable cataract. But as for western trade with the oases of the Sahara, donkeys and horses remained the dominant form of pack transportation. If camels had been known at all in the Sahara, they were a rare novelty. But the 1st century AD changed that. Balbus's expedition marked the first major use of camels for cargo transportation in the Sahara, but it was likely the newfound openness of trade between the Roman provinces in coastal North Africa and the Garamantes that truly turned the camel into a staple of Saharan life. Remember that Balbus's expedition, as well as halting Garamantian raids, was largely motivated by a desire to break the Garamantian monopoly on southern trade routes of garnet, ivory, and other products. Given the Roman victory in the conflict, the Sahara subsequently became more open to North African merchants, who brought not just horses and donkeys, but the newly introduced camels with them to cross the hostile desert. The introduction of the camel was both caused by, as well as an enabler of, the growth of trade between Rome and the Garamantes. While horses and donkeys remained in widespread use, camels gradually came to occupy a growing portion of the beasts of burden used in desert caravans. They brought with them multiple advantages in this setting. Due to their heat and drought resistance, camels were a more stable, long-term asset for a caravaneer, less likely to die during a route, and therefore a more profitable, but also safer option for trans-Saharan travel in the long term. They were also top-notch beasts of burden, being able to carry a much larger load on their back than a horse, meaning that each trip across the desert carried a higher quantity of valuable wares than it would have without a camel. To many merchants across Roman North Africa and the Sahara, the introduction of camels into the equation with their increased safety, longevity, and higher value for each trip seemed to be enough to swing the math, making it so that trips across the Sahara were now worth it to make economically. And so, more and more of them began to make the journey. With commerce accelerating and the city rebuilding, the city of Garama entered a new era of urban maturation in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD. Much of the city's ancient archaeological layer dates to this period, including the bulk of its most impressive structures which still stand, albeit in a ruined state, today. In terms of architectural history, The ancient city of Garama can generally be divided into two eras. The earlier period, comprising the rough first 600 years of the city's existence, is defined by the proliferation of interconnected grids of square, mud brick, and coarse sandstone home complexes. But around the period following Balbus's invasion, the architecture of Garama underwent a notable transition. While smaller homes, the homes presumably of working people, remained built in the old mud brick style, the homes of elites and public structures began to be built using a material called sandstone ashlar, a cut of quarried sandstone which utilized very little mortar between its sections when it was placed in a building, to the point where an ordinary person looking at it probably wouldn't observe mortar at all. The lack of mortar in ashlar, though, is a double-edged sword. While it gives it quite a distinct and interesting look, as well as reducing the amount of water that is necessary for construction, ashlar is much more difficult to lay than typical bricks, requiring incredibly precise placement, else risking a structural collapse. So the decision of Garamantian elites to build ashlar homes indicates not only Garamantian aesthetic tastes and a desire to preserve water, but also the presence of highly advanced and practiced masons in the city. In order to compensate for the weight of these buildings on the unstable Saharan ground, masons from Grama used sandstone ashlar to construct wide footings that disperse the weight of the building throughout a wider surface area, preventing their projects from sinking into the sandy earth. Besides the material used in each of the buildings, the architecture of classical Garama testifies not only to the city's growing wealth, but also to its increasing cosmopolitanism. The architecture of the city began to take on an ever more present Roman flair. Many of the motifs that we today associate with Roman architecture, such as wide horizontal orientation, the use of Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian columns, and triangular pediments above windows, and an emphasis on visual symmetry, are also present in Garamantian architecture from this period. The most striking example of cross-cultural pollination in Garama was the city's Great Bath. During its heyday, the bath likely resembled the famous baths of Rome to a T. Now, it's worth pointing out that we're not exactly sure what it looked like, nor even where it was, since all that remains of the bath to us today is a collection of widely scattered fragmentary pieces. However, these material fragments from the bath can give us some hints as to its appearance, such as the fact that the building featured a marble veneer. The marble veneer was likely quarried in Italy, and therefore would have had to take a long journey down to reach Garama for its use as the veneer to the bath. Additionally, these material fragments hint that the Garamantes likely utilized the same technology to warm the bath's water as the Romans did, due to the presence of scattered hypocaust tiles distributed throughout the city, most of which are covered on top by a thin layer of concrete. Hypocaust refers to a large space of area dug out underneath the building's floor, under which hot air would be circulated in through a burning furnace. This hot circulating air would then transfer up to the set of hypocaust tiles, then up to the layer of waterproof concrete that made up the floor of the bath. The result was the ancient equivalent of a jacuzzi. It's quite impressive that a technology this advanced managed to be adopted all the way across the Sahara, as the nearest example of such a bath that its builders would have been able to visit and study was the Buanjim garrison, about 600 kilometers north of Garama. It goes to show that even at this very early stage, trans-Saharan diffusion of knowledge was far from impossible. Interestingly, the Great Bath was clearly designed with the intention of serving as a public accommodation. While the ordinary masses of the city enjoyed the great public bath, archaeologist Muhammad Ayub discovered in his excavations that the larger homes of Garama featured similar systems but built in miniature, indicating that the nobility and royalty of the city had no interest in joining the unwashed common population in the public baths, instead choosing to relax in their own private facilities. Changes in home architecture and the existence of public and private baths are not the only evidence for growing social inequality in classical Garama. Graves also provide great insight on the growing divergence between the rich and poor. The most important gravesite near Garama is the Royal Necropolis, located on the outskirts of the old regional capital, Simkekra, an indicator that the ancient city retained an important religious role even long after it had fallen as an economic and political center. The so-called necropolis at Simkekra contains about 100 tombs, most of which are pyramidal sandstone stelae on top of a mastaba-like flat sandstone and mud base. While the general motif is fairly consistent, there is an impressive degree of creative variation between individual tombs. Some of the smaller tombs rise barely a few feet above the ground, resembling platforms in the earth more than a typical mausoleum, while other stelae tower as high as 15 feet. The most common motif here is a flat sandstone base with a stele on top of it that resembles what I can only describe as a small, sharply pitched pyramid, but with the top piece sliced off. A less common design was that of a brick form which curved upwards into a sort of cylindrical dome, or a curved mound featuring sides that jut in and out, almost like a vase. Close chemical analysis of these tombs has also indicated that during their heyday, the tombs were painted, with a deep red being the most popular pigment to choose. Most tombs also featured a small flat surface, either built into or standing independently outside of the structure, in which archaeologists have found the ancient remains of food, indicating that these flat surfaces were used as offering plates for the spirits of the people resting there, and showing us that the Garamantes, like most people around the world, believed that their ancestors lived on after death and gave them regular offerings as a result. Beyond that, though, due to the lack of discernible sources, we know shockingly little about the Garamantian religion, their views on death and mortality, or which deities they believed in, or even how they performed worship. Some archaeologists, including Muhammad Ayub, speculate that certain archaeological sites at Garama may have been the remains of temples, but even he was quite unsure about which ones were which. The proposed temples in Garama aren't really that distinct in appearance from the houses of wealthy residents, and are really only distinguished by their occasional religious objects found within them. These objects mostly consist of small figurines, often imported from abroad. For example, a little figurine was uncovered in the style of ancient Egyptian art, depicting what appears to be a version of the ancient Egyptian creator god, Amun. When you think about the timeline here, this may shock you at first. I mean, an ancient Egyptian god being worshipped in the Fezzan? Almost 500 years since the fall of the last local Egyptian dynasty, and almost 2 centuries after the Roman conquest of Egypt? However, the worship of Amun in this setting is not as anachronistic or out of place as you might think. See, ancient Egyptian religion was, surprisingly, not just contained to Egypt, but actually quite widespread. By the time that the last local Egyptian dynasty fell, the Egyptian pantheon of gods was already widely worshipped in many of the regions near Egypt, such as Nubia, Syria, and coastal Libya. By the time of the classical Garamantian period, Egyptian religion was even widely influential across the Mediterranean and within Rome itself, with a not insignificant niche of Roman citizens partaking in a fringe group called the Cult of Isis, an admittedly quite Hellenized version of worship of the exotic Egyptian goddess of magic. If we believe this figurine to be a hint, it appears that Egyptian gods like Amun were also worshipped in the Garamantian kingdom. Other artifacts seemingly back up this assertion, such as a clay figurine of a humanoid figure with large curling ram horns on the side of his head, another symbol closely associated with Amun, especially in Greek, Roman, and Libyan depictions of the god. By the way, fun fact, if we have any paleontology fans listening, ammonites, those prehistoric mollusks with long curled shells, are named after this depiction of Amun, with goat horns, since their shells were originally seen as resembling the curled horns of a goat, and therefore the curled horns of Amun. While we know that the Garamantes, or at least a segment of the population, engaged in the worship of Egyptian deities from figurines and similar artifacts, it's not clear at all to what extent they adopted other elements of Egyptian religion. Notably, we can presume that Garamantian burials are quite different from Egyptian funerary practices. Garamantian tombs often included few to no personal belongings compared to the treasure troves that are found within ancient Egyptian tombs. The only object that is found consistently within Garamantian grave sites is a small wooden headrest. These headrests were likely part of the burial process itself, with the deceased person being buried lying down on top of a headrest, in a pose to make them look asleep and relaxed. Similar to how most societies today will pose dead bodies for open casket funerals on a pillow to make them look relaxed. Archaeologists have also occasionally uncovered bits of pottery in Garamantian tombs, usually imported varieties from either Carthage in pre-classical sites or Rome in the classical era sites, with this pottery perhaps serving as a cultural marker of an individual's social prestige or wealth. But yeah, compared to the lavishly decorated and fully furnished tombs of ancient Egypt, Garamantian tombs with their headrests and maybe piece of imported pottery are quite small in comparison, which is a pretty strong indication that the Garamantians, unlike the Egyptians, didn't place a big emphasis on the dead needing their personal possessions in the afterlife. For most people in and around Grama, though, their bodies would not rest near Sinkekra, but rather in several other less opulent necropolis in the surrounding rocky escarpments near the Wadi al-Ajal. It's pretty obvious that the main reason for using these rocky escarpments as opposed to fertile arable land in the Wadi was that arable land was uncommon and precious. But it's also possible that the symbolic nature of the position may have had something to do with this trend as well. Among the many cultures that occupy arid parts of the world, it's not uncommon for the desert to be associated with death and solitude, while community and life are associated with oases, wadis, and other fertile patches. This attitude towards certain types of land still pervades among many people of the Sahara today, so while it's a bit of a stretch, it's totally plausible that the positioning of graves in the desert may have been motivated not just by practical land use considerations, but also by a wider association between the desert and death. However, like sadly many things in Garamantian history, this is largely a matter of speculation. As I've mentioned many times throughout the season, the main reason for the lack of knowledge about the Garamantian religion and life and just the kingdom itself is the utter lack of records that we can read produced in Garama, as well as the destruction of the vast majority of written records from their closest major neighbor, Carthage. However, you shouldn't get the wrong impression that the Garamantes were an illiterate people. No, in reality, the Garamantes were literate, but we have yet to even remotely understand their writing system. Garamantian writing utilized a unique variation of the Libyc writing system, or as it's more commonly known, Proto-Tifinagh. Proto-Tifinagh writing was used widely across North Africa in the ancient past, but was never codified or standardized by any type of ruling authority. For this reason, the system varies immensely from region to region, and while some varieties have been fully deciphered and translated, others, such as the Garamantian version, are only partially understood. Additionally, even if we do fully decipher the script, there's still another problem awaiting us, which is translating it. See, it's not even clear what language the Garamantians spoke, if there even was a single unifying language throughout the empire at all. Ancient sources about the Garamantes make no reference to their language whatsoever, with no mentions of any similarity or distinction from the languages of their northern Amazigh neighbors. This has led to some fairly intense debate about which language was even spoken in the area. For a long time, the dominant assumption was that they were simply Amazigh speakers, but in my opinion, the most exciting hypothesis is the idea that the Garamantes may have spoken a Nilo-Saharan language, similar to the languages spoken by the Tubal people of modern southern Libya, including in the Tibesti Mountains, which isn't all that far from the Wadi al-Ajal in the grand scheme of things. If this were true, then the Garamantian writing system would be the only documented example of the Tifinagh script being widely used to record a non-Amazigh language. But, well, when it comes to historical reality, it's generally not a great idea to judge the likelihood of an idea off of how quote unquote cool it would be. The absence of any mention of similarities between Amazigh and the Garamantian language may have simply been due to the authors of ancient texts assuming that their readers would already know about the linguistic similarity between them, or just that it wasn't seen as that big of a deal. This question could be answered by translating the Garamantian script and comparing its language to Amazigh languages from the same time period, but to be honest, there hasn't really been a big push to decipher the script among archaeologists and linguists. Why? Well, it's because they don't feature anything that was probably of much importance. Sadly, pretty much all the examples of Garamantian writing we have are short inscriptions on tombs, and so far, we've never found anything more than that. This small sample size also makes the translation harder, as archaeologists interested in the topic have fewer examples of the script to work with, so they have a harder time looking for patterns or inconsistencies with other variations of Proto-Tifinagh. So, unless there's a sudden Rosetta Stone-esque breakthrough discovery, at least for now it seems unlikely that we're going to know the meaning of the words that the Garamantes etched into their royal gravesites. While the classical Garamantian period is mostly understood as a period of relative peace between Rome and Grama, the reality of Garamantian military affairs during this period is a little bit more complicated. See, Balbus's campaign across the desert in 19 BC appears to have briefly asserted Roman dominance over their southern neighbors, not making any pretenses of annexing or vassalizing them, but instead making a clear, undisputable statement of Roman military strength in order to prevent raids and allow passage of Roman merchants. While this was seemingly effective for a while, throughout the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, the Garamantes would still intermittently test the extent of Roman dominance in North Africa, and still find sneaky ways to assert their status as a power in their own right. The biggest opportunity for the Garamantes came in 68 AD, during a period of intense instability in the Roman Empire. To make a long story short, the unpopular Roman Emperor Nero had committed suicide, leading to a period of intense civil strife that the Romans would go on to call the Year of the Four Emperors, due to the high volume of the leaders being assassinated or overthrown and replaced, four in a single year. Roman North Africa was, of course, in the thick of the chaos, with different governors of the province of Africa picking sides in the conflict, being overthrown, replaced, or going into a rebellion depending on where they stood. Even at a local level, certain city officials would take up arms against each other, depending on where they stood in the Civil War, or in some cases, just due to ancient grudges or economic rivalries. One such case occurred when the city of Oea, located near modern Tripoli on the Libyan coast, attacked their neighboring city, Leptis Magna, after a dispute over farmlands and theft escalated into an all-out civil war in the province of Africa. The Roman provincial government was dealing with their own problems, including the assassination of their most recent provincial governor, and therefore were helpless to stop the fighting. In this era of chaos in North Africa, the Garamantes took their opportunity, declaring support for Oea's war and using it as an excuse to invade Leptis Magna, besieging the city and plundering the countryside of valuables, including enslaving many of its local inhabitants. However, Garamantian success in the conflict wouldn't last very long. When the political dust eventually settled and relative stability returned to the province of Africa, the provincial governor sent an army of cavalry to attack the Garamantian raiders. The Garamantes were quickly expelled, with captured Garamantian prisoners of war even being fed to lions in the Leptis Magna Colosseum as punishment. Interestingly, a Roman North African artist captured the moment of a terrified Garamantian prisoner about to be pounced on and mauled by the deadly big cat in a tile mosaic, giving us the most definitive image of what the Garamantes may have looked like. The Garamantians in the artwork are depicted with a dark caramel skin tone, loose curls, and dark brown hair. It's also worth noting that even just within this one piece of art, the Roman artist highlighted the phenotypical diversity of the Garamantes, with one man having a noticeably darker complexion than the other. As for hints about Garamantian clothing, the mosaic is, well, pretty much useless, as the men are dressed in clothing typical for a Roman arena execution as opposed to normal Garamantian clothing. Following the raids on Leptis Magna, Roman and Garamantian relations would return to relative normalcy shortly after the raiders were expunged, with Garamantian raids continuing to be a problem, but rarely at large enough a scale to elicit a Roman response. This status quo remained in place throughout the entirety of the 2nd century, and wouldn't change again until the rule of Roman Emperor Septimius Severus in the early 3rd century. It's worth noting that Severus himself was from the province of Africa, so the problem of Garamantian raids was a little bit more personal and familiar to him, while the fate of his homeland of Africa was of greater importance to him than it would have been to his predecessors. Severus therefore invested in the expansion of Roman fortifications along their Saharan frontier, and again ordered an invasion that traveled south and even captured the city of Garama. As a result, Severus was able to accomplish something no other Roman leader had done, and secure a lasting end to Garamantian raids into the province of Africa. This era of peace between the Romans and Garamantes would permeate all the way until the loss of Roman sovereignty over the territory hundreds of years later. By the 200s AD, the Garamantian kingdom was experiencing what can only be described as a proper golden age. The capital city of the kingdom swelled in population, with estimates for the city's number of residents ranging from about 10,000 to 30,000 people. While this might seem pretty small by today's standards, By the standards of the ancient worlds, this was a respectable size for a city, especially given its tough geographic position. As far as we know, it was almost certainly the largest urban center in the Sahara Desert to this point, and would likely remain the peak population of a Sahara settlement for the greater part of a millennium. Even today, with our modern technology making arid settlements more populous than ever before, ancient Garama, if it existed as peak population, would still be on the larger end of Libyan Saharan settlements. Besides its scale, the city was also respected for its arts and culture, its economic prosperity, and its high living standards, with a life expectancy equaling and even surpassing that of ancient Rome. However, while the Garamantes civilization reached its peak of complexity and scale in the 3rd century, this way of life could not be supported forever. Join us in our next episode as we examine what happened in Garama that brought this tremendous and fascinating civilization to an end. Before you go, as you could probably tell from that unsubtly foreboding conclusion, the Garamantes season is quickly coming to an end very soon. Yes, I know that this is an unprecedentedly short season, but, well, that's what happens when you enter a setting that is so lacking in documentation compared to all the other areas we've covered. But don't fret, every end is a new beginning. That means it's time to pick our new season's destination. As per tradition, our next season will focus on somewhere in East Africa, and by the time this episode goes up, a new poll on the Patreon will appear with a series of choices for next season to focus on. Will we explore the forgotten history of Christian kingdoms of medieval Nubia? Maybe uncover the shocking stories of the fascinating cities of the Swahili coast? Or will we sail the Indian Ocean with the merchants of medieval Somalia? Or maybe you have something entirely different on your mind altogether. If you want to make sure your voice is heard, please go to patreon.com/historyofafrica. Become a member and vote in the poll for next season. And to those already supporting the show, a heartfelt thank you. Thank you for listening to the History of Africa podcast. If you like our show, then we would greatly appreciate if you could help support the show and our project of freely available online history education. You can do this by supporting us at patreon.com/historyofafrica, providing us a rating or review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or iTunes, or by sharing the podcast with anyone who you think might enjoy learning about African history. This episode is brought to you by our supporters on Patreon, including Naomi Kanakia, Ayofagbamie, Dimitri, Alexander Travis, BB Milliam, Conrad Schwenke, Johnny Knowles, Godfrey Sabalabie, Pascal Mokocha, Joe Maxwell, Nkechi Nwawadike, Sheunoronti Mine, Kwajo Mankwa, Douglas Harder and Sherry Robinson, Craig Bolton, Samuel Badeau, Ghassan Virgiani, Ni T, Kitty, Tariq Beetleman, Kelvin J. Norris, and Ellen Fisher, among others. Thank you all for supporting the show. It really, really, really means a lot.